Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to another edition of Credit Safe webinars. Excited to be here with you today, as always. We've been doing these a lot. It's great to get a chance each and every week to bring you a bunch of information about the B2B industries and the world that we all work and live in. My name is Nathan Kolb. I will be your host today. I am the brand engagement guy here at Credit Safe, and I get the chance to host these webinars as well, which is one of the more fun parts of my job. Just to give you kind of an overview, if you're new to our webinars, these are interactive. We want you to go back and forth with us and talk with us. So at the bottom of your screen, there is a little text bubble that says Q&A over it. That will be open and available to you at all times during the webinar. If you want to send in a question, if you need to ask us something, or if you need to let us know something, please use that. I will be monitoring that the whole time. And as we go, as we have breaks, as we have chances in the conversation to bring up those questions, I will do so. I may not read them verbatim. I may kind of put a couple that are similar together, but please understand that I'll be answering all of those throughout. We're not going to hold them to the end. So if any time you have a question for that's on topic, that's for our speaker, then go right ahead. And speaking of our speaker, Gabrielle is going to be with us today. I'm excited to have her. Gabrielle is known as America's millennial expert. Yes, there is such a thing, a millennial expert. She is one of the most requested speakers on generational leadership and millennial motivation. She's a best-selling author of 4 books with another one coming out that'll be out very soon. She's been featured on NPR, SiriusXM, Fox Business, Time, I'm getting bored here, many other media outlets, as she's smiling at me here going, yeah, just keep it going, bud. Gabrielle's popular TED Talk, TEDx Talk, which if you haven't seen, definitely look up after this webinar, has taken her all over the world speaking on these topics. She's the founder and president of the Millennial Solution and co-founder of the Purpose Company, both of which are based in Dallas, Texas, where she is living there in Dallas with her husband, Brian. There's more and more that we could go and talk about here about Gabrielle. She's amazing. And in the interest of full disclosure, has been a friend of mine for several years. So I may be a little bit more hyped here because she's just awesome to hang out with as well. But welcome. Gabrielle, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be chatting with you. And it's kind of fun when you get to do some of these webinars and be able to, talk with folks who are friends and who are experts in their own right and, have a conversation about how do we engage the next generation? What is this whole COVID thing doing to the generations? And then be able to answer some questions for the folks who are joining us here on the webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm hoping we're going to have a lot of good conversation. I know you and I tend to have good conversation, so we'll go back and forth, but hopefully all these folks that are joining us right now will join in and ask questions as we go. Love the view, by the way. That's a great background, way better than mine, but a great view behind you there. So hopefully that won't be too distracting for folks.
I've tried some of those like backdrop things that like the virtual backgrounds and stuff, but right. So yours looks very cool. Mine just happens to be actually what it looks outside all the time.
Downtown Dallas, a bunch of buildings.
Right? yeah. I am where I say that I am. I'm not like on the beach or anything, although that would be pretty awesome, but I'm not.
That would be kind of fun. I think a lot of us right now would love to be on the beach and doing this webinar from the beach, but unfortunately not right now, at least, right? So let's kind of jump in. I read your bio and I gave the intro on all the stuff that you've done, or at least some of the stuff that you've done and all that. But give me a little bit of your background. Give me a little bit of your journey and how you became this millennial expert, how you became this person who deals with generational leadership and generational change.
Yeah, becoming a millennial expert isn't exactly something that you go to school for. I think sometimes people ask or assume that I majored in something in an undergrad situation, or maybe I got my master's in it. I certainly didn't. I majored in politics and theology. So the two things that you're not supposed to talk about at Thanksgiving, I decided to major in both of them. But through everything, I really started to see the world through kind of this generational lens, realizing that particularly when it comes to young people, that there were a lot of stigmas, a lot of ideas about what the next generation was, who the next generation was, and frankly, what was wrong with us. And so I've been in this space for a number of years. I wrote my first book about millennials when I was 17, going into college, having kind of come from a world where I could see the writing on the wall that people were really looking kind of cockeyed at this next generation, not understanding who they were. So I started really early on in my career and kind of had built my entire career around studying this next generation, looking at what it was going to be like when we were entering into the workforce, what did it look like when we were exiting, and then now as millennials are, upper 30s even, now what does it look like now that we're becoming leaders, founders, investors, homeowners, parents? It's no longer this millennial as the intern or the kid next door, really seeing this next generation as being a partner in developing the economy.
Right. And I love that you bring that up right away, because that generation, the generational title, the millennials, has been thrown around so often, and I hear it now. And both of us are millennials, and you hear it, and, oh, those millennials in college. I'm like, there are no millennials in college anymore. Like, we're out, stop. Like, we're out here, you're talking to one. So I appreciate that you kind of gave that as a breakdown. If you would, could you just really quickly, to give folks an idea, could you give the generational breakdown of the generations kind of in the workforce today?
Sure. Yeah. So when we're talking about generations, these are things, terms that we use to describe folks who are born in a certain amount of time period. And it's certainly not a perfect way to describe it. A lot of times when I'm speaking or doing conferences or working with teams, people will come up to me and say, well, Gabrielle, you said that I was, born in this era, but really act more like this. And certainly that's the case. So before I share, I'll give a bit of a caveat, because these are things that tend to be true. So we call them archetypes. So, you could, be born in the 80s, but still, maybe act more like a baby boomer. So it's, certainly very, very common. So the generations are pretty simple. So the traditionalists are born between 1925 and 1945. The baby boomers, who were the largest generation in American history till they had kids, were born between 1946 and 1964. Generation X is born between 1965 and 1982, and millennials are born between, or I should have said 81, millennials are born between 1982 and 1996. And then Generation Z, which is that next generation that now everyone's scratching their heads wondering, well, what's wrong with them? They're born between 1997 and 2019. And so that conversation around, well, now we had 4 generations in the workplace, now we have 4 going on 5, because people are staying longer in their roles. We have just a more multi-generational culture overall, because people are living longer, which is great. And so because of that, the conversation, I think, around generations is so important, not only from a workforce perspective, but certainly as we see where people are staying home now, where people are working from home. Technology is one of the most obvious ways that you can kind of differentiate between one generation over the next. Which I'm sure that we'll get to here in a moment. But what we've actually found to be most influential to determine someone's birth, like birth generation type, is what generation actually raised you. So sometimes, and I know you guys work a lot internationally, people ask, well, is this just an American phenomenon? And we worked around the world, particularly in Europe and Latin America. And we've analyzed and conducted studies that have looked at generations across different cultural platforms. And what we found was, what we are seeing here in the United States is what tends to be true in other countries as well. And the simple truth came down to what generation was raising you. That was really the one differentiator. So for example, my mom is born in 1946. So she is first year of the baby boomers. She's not on this, so I can tell everyone how old she is. So she's 74. And so she was born in 46. My husband's parents are first year of Generation X. So they were born in 65. So there's an entire generation between the two, and he and I are the same age. And so the way that we see the world is certainly influenced by that. Their parenting style was certainly influenced by that generation. And so I see myself acting much more like a typical millennial than maybe my husband, who acts much more like a typical Gen Xer, which we'll talk about more in a moment about how Gen Z and Gen X are actually super, super similar and how they interact, which is a bit of an anomaly. I'll try not to geek out too much on the generational science side of things, but I think it is really important. I think it is really interesting for us here stateside who are looking at, okay, this is a conversation we've been having for the last 10 years. Some of these other countries are finally having these same conversations and looking to us saying, well, how have you guys been able to fix it? And so hopefully we'll get into some of the strategies, some of the programs and things that work really well, whether you're trying to deal with your millennial kids who, won't call you back or, text you back, or your Gen Z kids, or the people on your team who are of a different generation as well.
Right. I appreciate the overview. I just want to make sure, we're kind of on the same page as we go forward here. But let's kind of dive into the topic at hand today of what's going on and take us back. It seems like a lifetime ago, but take us back to the end of 2019 and kind of where was corporate America? Where was the workforce, the businesses and everything going as far as generations go? How was that generational shift looking, end of 2019, basically pre-COVID? How are we looking?
Yeah, I'll focus most of my conversation around the workforce versus the marketing side of things, because we've done a lot of work with that as well, as how do you market to a multi-generational audience. But on the workforce side of things, we're really starting to see, I think, a flow of what I call generational empathy, where I think that there was certainly an increase in, because of webinars like this and training, and I think just societally us realizing it's not a bad thing that we have different perspectives on technology, work-life balance, family values. That diversity really does make us stronger. So I think going into COVID, certainly on the whole, I think that there was a good rush towards having some of these values kind of be front and center. There's certainly, I think, a questioning about Generation Z. Whenever you introduce a new ingredient to a recipe, you never know how it's going to react. And I think that that's certainly the case with Generation Z. So as I kind of previewed a bit in my last answer, Generation Z is a bit of an anomaly for those of us who study generations. So every generation rebels against the generation that raised them. So you see these micro rebellions where you see whether it's values or education or types of jobs, you see these kind of little micro rebellions. So Generation Z is actually replicating their parents, which are Generation X. So they have a lot of the same values, which include everything from, extremely pragmatic and practical to a little skeptical to, using technology really as a tool. Whereas millennials, I think, were one of the first generation using technology as an identity. And so we start to see some kind of interesting patterns emerge. So now that Gen Z is in college and graduating from college, I think that the workforce was just starting to get used to millennials. And I think many folks that we're working with keep trying to use the same solutions that they learned and adopted to work with millennials on Generation Z. And we're realizing pretty quickly it wasn't working. But now post-COVID, it's really interesting where, and this is true in all of societies, that the young influence the standard. And so we now have companies that I'm working with who are doing onboarding videos on TikTok, and they're doing training in their Instagram stories. So, we're really seeing that younger audience, even if Gen Z isn't fully in the workforce yet, they're already influencing how people are communicating and using, entertainment platforms, for example, is a great way to do it. Social media certainly has changed so much of the world, as evidenced by what we're doing right now. But I think that shift is now much more focused on young people influencing the standard, I think, moving forward in the workforce.
Okay. Yeah. And you mentioned, I find it funny, you mentioned TikTok, because that was from January through to April, it was the most downloaded app in all of the app stores for those months. And it is just adjusted to where Zoom is now looking to take it over in May. But you think all the changes, all the people having to download Zoom and all of this, yet TikTok was the thing. It was what everybody's doing. So I find it just an interesting thing, as you're saying. It's influencing what's going on, not only in culture, but also in the workforce. So, okay, let's fast forward into 2020. You know, we all do our celebrations for 2020. We're going to have a great year. It's you know, going to be the start of a new decade, blah, blah, blah. And then COVID. You know, we kind of get smacked upside the head and the world turns upside down. Do we see, is there a difference between how the generations are handling this, how they're handling the pandemic and all that's come with it? Or is it just everybody's just dealing with it?
I think that there's certainly a survive to thrive mindset for every generation, but it was really interesting just seeing the world through kind of the generational lens that I have, seeing how people were starting to react as the news started to come out. So, for example, really early on during spring break, there was a lot of bad press out there about millennials going on spring break. What actually wasn't millennials, because we're too old for that.
Right.
So we're like we're too old and tired and have too much student debt to go on spring break. But I'm really excited for Generation Z. But it was interesting. I mean, so many people were giving these young people a hard time when in reality for the month prior, those last four weeks before everyone was going on spring break, everyone in the news was like, oh, if you're young, you're fine. You know, you're going to be fine. You'll be immune. You know, it's not going to impact you. So yet again, I think it's an example of sometimes we get mad at people for listening to us, and particularly for that younger generation. So I think that every generation is kind of falling into line of what I would expect them to do. I mean, traditionalists are really, really effective at setting and following rules. So traditionalists are the parents of the baby boomer generation, so which are not great at setting and following rules, because that baby boomer generation, although they were one of the last generations in American history to be raised by military or military era parents as a whole, they crave structure, but they rebel against someone telling them what to do. So that's where you see a lot of, traditionalists who are saying, this is important. This is what the government's telling us to do. We need to abide by the rules. Then you see baby boomers who are their kids, very similar to my mother, who is going to Trader Joe's like 4 times a week just to have social interaction with folks, or my dad's having like wine parties with his friends, and they're all in their 70s and they're not really like abiding. She's like, oh, I'm wearing gloves. I'm like, Mom, it's the same gloves you've worn all week. It doesn't work that way. So
that's right.
There's, so it's been kind of a funny dynamic of seeing a lot of baby boomers who now I think, they're certainly, I think, probably abiding by the rules more, but at the beginning it was like, no, don't tell me what to do. This is like the flower child generation. So, they came up with the concept of don't trust anybody over the age of 30. And then they turned 31 and decided, things will be better when we're in charge. Generation X is very good at following the rules and is kind of like the accountability partner that everybody needs. And so if you've noticed on social media, they're the ones posting like, well, let's make sure everybody that you're washing your hands, or here's, 5 tips on how to, make your own mask. And they're really, really focused on taking care of them and their family, because most of them have very young families, which is going to be really important as well. So they're not looking really at the macro as much as they are at the micro about where am I and what can I control. That's very different than millennials, who have the let's save the world complex, where, they're coming in. They're the generation type also known as a hero generation. So you're seeing this younger generation coming in and trying to solve the world's problems and, trying to get our parents to stay home. And that reversal has been really funny for me to watch, where it's just like a bunch of young people yelling at our parents to stay home. We're like, no, you can't go out with your friends. Okay. You need to stay home. So that role reversal has certainly been kind of interesting. And then, Gen Z is really in some of the most formative years of their life. And so I'm really going to be interested to see how this impacts them. They're already very pragmatic. They're already very kind of skeptical of authority, and are really looking at, what makes sense. Like many of them, for example, they're one of the first generations that are not going to be going to college and university at the same levels that millennials and their previous generations did, because they're looking to go to trade schools or get certified in something. So it's really going to change the way that they expect to work and interact with people. And I think that it's probably going to change a lot of the social dynamics as well once things start to open back up again.
Okay. And that kind of gives me a question there. I know for myself personally, and I know for you somewhat, and for a lot of other folks, especially the millennial generation, it was like, hey, I can Zoom in, or I can FaceTime in, or I can whatever. I work great in my pajamas. I'll get the work done. I just don't need to show up, at a certain time in a certain place to make this happen. Can I just work remotely, please? Like, do I really have to do this? And I don't need sick time necessarily. There's a lot of other things. You said, it'd be great if we could be doing this on the beach. I can work from the beach. Hint to the credit safe executives that like to help me with these things. I would love to do one of these from the beach anytime you want to send me. But we've been clamoring for this, and I say we because I know it's something that I've done, and I'm fortunate in that I do work remotely all the time. But is this going to change now that everybody's doing it? Do you think there's going to be a shift as we look to quote unquote get back to work? Is this going to hold? Is this going to be something we're going to see? Or is this just we have no clue?
I think it's pretty interesting. Yes, as particularly young people who have been raised on technology, where we've had the mindset that I got my degree online, or, I Zoom with my friends or my family, and yet I can't use technology to work from home. Right. I think that expectation coming into the workforce has caused many folks to label younger people entitled because they're wanting to change things and do things on their own terms. But now those terms are being forced upon all of us. Right. And it's interesting to see a lot of the companies that we're working with who are making a shift because, yes, many of their young people have been coming and expecting to work from home, but not everybody thrives in a work from home environment. Sure. So I think it's important to, no matter what happens, not have a stigma attached to whether someone works well from home or doesn't. I mean, I just was having a conversation with a colleague of mine yesterday who was talking about how he's like, I don't work well from home. And he said, it's really hard for me to admit that to the rest of the company because they don't necessarily, they just, so many people have been working so hard to be able to work from home. They don't want me to say I don't work well from home because it's going to kind of jeopardize that benefit for other people. Sure. But if it's your career and productivity and frankly, the kind of future of the company at stake, I think it is important that we train people to be able to be open and vulnerable about whether or not they work well. Because if you don't have a dedicated office space, if maybe you don't have the kind of environment that you're going to work well in, I've worked from home since I started my company when I was 23 years old. But those first few months were certainly an adjustment where you're having to decide, no, I'm not going to do laundry in the middle of the day, right? Like, right. No, I'm not going to, that yoga class sounds great. I'm not going to do it right now because I need to be focused. So I think the conversation around optimizing your workplace and being position agnostic is going to be really, really important. And so that's what I think we're going to end up doing. Are more companies going to be dissolving some of their physical assets, moving away from having a brick and mortar building? Absolutely. Are we going to see more interactive technologies like Zoom, but on steroids so that people can be more interactive and be more effective? Absolutely. So I'm interested and excited in some regards about that. But I think no matter what, I think it's important to recognize that this whole season, I think, has also taught us the importance of human connection. And right. Particularly millennials, for example, who've been clamoring for work from home. I think this is truly the lesson in when you get what you want, you don't want it anymore. Because now they're saying, I wanted to work from home, but now they're like, let me out of my house. Right. So, maybe this is going to kind of backfire in a way where it's kind of like, if you ate too many cherries as a kid, you hate cherries as an adult. So I don't know if that's going to be the case, if millennials are going to get kind of overdrawn on the whole like work from home thing and they're wanting to have more human interaction. That's what I think is going to happen. I think right. People are going to realize this is a great holdover, but there's still the power of productivity. And ultimately, I think output is going to say, the companies who have great metrics and actually measure people's output, they're really going to come out winning. The people who say, work around homeschooling your kids or work around this or work around that, aren't going to be as excited or interested in continuing on with these policies once things open back up.
Gotcha. And do you think that's going to play in at all, whether just with the millennials or with any of the generations, on how long they want to stay in the workforce, where they want to live even? There's been some studies conducted just recently within the last month or so about cost of living in different areas, and what apartment can you rent or what house can you buy in, say, I know you lived in DC for a while, say in the Northern Virginia area versus a Chicago or Dallas or something like that. There's a big difference in what the same numbers will buy you in those places. And if I don't have to go into the office every day, I can work for a little bit longer, possibly. Yeah. I mean, do you think that's going to be, and I don't mean each day work longer, I mean, in my livelihood, in my workforce career. Do you think those are going to play into it? Are we going to see a shift in that regard? Or is that something we were already seeing and this is just going to exacerbate it?
Yeah, I think yes to both of those. We've certainly seen people staying in the workforce longer for a number of reasons. So the average retirement age used to be 56 and now it's 64. And so people are pushing off retirement longer and longer because, we're living longer, which is fantastic, but also too, the cost of living is increasing, as you mentioned. Many people have, multiple mortgages, or they're putting their kids through college, or they're going back to school, or unforeseen circumstances. And so they're having to stay in the workforce by necessity, not necessarily by choice. So I think young people, millennials in particular, are going to stay in longer as well, simply because we have a different mindset about retirement. So, and I think Tim Ferriss, who is kind of like that legendary podcaster, 4-Hour Work Week, is kind of the icon of this mindset that really sunk down deep into millennials as they were coming of age, where he has these, I think he calls them like mini retirements, where he goes away, for, 6 to 8 weeks, a couple times a year. So that mindset for young people has not been, I'm going to wait until I retire to enjoy my time. They're saying, I'm going to enjoy my time now. And so because of that, I actually think that millennials will stay in the workforce longer, just simply because we have been able to create, if you want to call it work-life balance, I call it work-life integration, because there's really no such thing as balance when it comes to these concepts. But they're staying longer in the workforce simply because they didn't get burned out at a younger age, where maybe older generations had very clear lines between work life and home life. And they were kind of working towards that end goal of the, the gold watch and like the, the Cadillac driving off into the sunset in Florida. So I think that that's certainly going to change. And I think technology is going to, change more and more when it comes to lifespan, when it comes to the type of work that we do. And I think geography will certainly play a role in that as well, where, and we were already starting to see that. Like you mentioned, we started the firm in DC, and that was really at the height of when large companies were starting to do more hoteling. So they were dissolving their large corporate structures. People were working from home or hoteling. Then they started to see a dip in productivity. So they started to go back to the traditional corporate structure. So I'm a data girl, I'm a nerd. So if the numbers don't lie, let's look at the numbers versus what everybody else is doing, because it's going to be unique to the industry. It's going to be unique to your company and your culture. And I think it's important, again, to track what's working and what's not working, because if not, then you're just going to end up doing something that's a corporate trend, but it's not necessarily going to benefit you or your company.
So for those companies that, and I'm going to just kind of with what you're talking about, for those companies that are dealing with remote work right now and doing all of that, what do you think they should be tracking right now? You've mentioned that a couple of times. What are some really good things they should be looking at as they're trying to manage this shift in the way we're working, and as far as looking at it as things start opening back up? I know, like you said, you're in Dallas, and I know Texas has opened up a bit more than I'm in Virginia than what Virginia has, but Virginia has opened up more than, say, New York or Pennsylvania. So there's stages that everybody's in. What should companies be looking for, the folks that are listening, and what should they be looking for right now?
Yeah, really great point. So, I mean, of course, you're going to be looking at just your basic outputs of whatever your team is going to be measuring, like whether that's your project management numbers. The specifics is going to be, based off of whatever team you're on and whatever your end goals are. What the nuance really comes in is to expected versus actual. And that's really where I'm seeing companies fall through, is they're saying, well, we expect to, well, number one, that I think the biggest challenge people had is that they expected people to come into this work from home situation with the same levels of productivity than they had when they were in the workplace, which set up impossible standards, and I think really set people up for failure, especially for parents who are homeschooling their kids, or people who are having to learn how to cobble together, something that is going to help them focus to stay at work. That adjustment period, I think, wasn't necessarily accounted for. So, but now that we've been in it for a few weeks, I think looking, expected versus actual. So what do we expect to get done this week and what is actually produced? And then looking at that year over year to say, okay, great, let's compare our April 2020 numbers to our April 2019. Where was the dip? What was our actual versus what's our actual now? And are we still on track? I think that's going to be the most important for folks moving forward. And that doesn't just start at the corporate level, it goes right down to the individual. So for example, if you're working with a remote team, some of the really effective things that we've seen is that you have to, again, focus on that expected and actual for the individual and talk about what those expectations are for while someone's working from home. So is your expectation, I'm still going to work 8 hours a day, or is your expectation that and I'm only going to work Monday through Friday, or I'm going to work Monday through Thursday? We can be much more flexible in our work schedules now that everyone is working remotely. So with that, having a conversation around what's going to work well for that employee, I think is going to be really important, and checking in to say, is this working for you? Because one of the really exciting things I think this is doing is it's teaching people to take ownership of their time in a much more structured way, where people before had the forced physical structure of going into the office and sitting at a desk and working in these kind of confines of a traditional work environment. But things are very different now. So I think it's really important for individuals to set their expected and actual as well. So that way they can say, hey, I'm on track to meet my goals, and then make sure that that's done in chorus of the other people on the team. Because if not, then you're going to start to see challenges in the long term, not only from the output level of making sure you're hitting your numbers, but from a cultural standard as well. Because if people aren't being productive, then they don't feel valued. If they don't feel valued, they don't feel like they're contributing, and then then they start to become more disengaged. So it's certainly, I think, a slippery slope. But it's, I think, really important, no matter what, when it comes to metrics. And I say this all the time to my team, just make sure you're not measuring things for measuring things' sake. Make sure that it's actually tied to a true outcome, and that there's buy-in on what that outcome is. Because if you care about measuring something, then you're going to pay attention to it. But if you don't care about it, then it's just another number you have to report on.
Gotcha. Great advice there. We're starting to come up against time here, so I'm going to ask one more question. And if we get some audience questions coming in here, I'll try and shove them in as well, and get you to answer them quickly. But you've got this litany of amazing corporations and government agencies. I know recently you were working with the Air Force, and all of this, all on this idea of generational leadership and generational shifts and all of that. What kind of is like the key things that we need to take away just to understand or know about leadership theory when it comes to generations and leading companies and the shift that's going on?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see. I know I'd mentioned just how different generations are reacting to the COVID crisis, but we also do see within organizations just the different leadership styles come out in really bright ways. So a quick overview, you see boomers tend to lead from the top down, again, because they're last kind of military era. They understand structure and they want to put everything in a structure. So they're, the A and then a B and then, step C kind of mindset. They're very linear, which is very different than, say, the millennial generation, which is much more abstract. So millennials are coming in saying, why do you do B? Why are we using letters? dollars, not numbers, and why isn't there an app for it, and asking a lot of those questions. And older generations have been raised to see questions as challenges, whereas younger generations see questions as invitations to collaborate. So there's an understanding gap, I think, that those in leadership need to adopt, that they see younger people as folks who are wanting to come in and ask questions, and that's a sign of them engaging. I tell people all the time, if your millennials stop asking questions, that's when you need to be concerned, because that's usually when they're looking for another job. So fire and feed that question, curiosity in your young employees. It's going to be really important. Generation X tends to lead from the side. So also known as a latchkey generation, they are the generation that doesn't want to be told what to do or how to do it. They'll figure it out on their own. They figured out how to, go to college and like make pizza bites and like do all the things that it took to raise themselves essentially. So they're very, very, again, pragmatic. And so because of that, they're not looking for someone to tell them what to do, and they don't want to micromanage other people as well. So Gen X loves themselves some checklists. So give them a checklist of things to do. They'll figure it out. They'll check it off. They'll probably put something on the checklist that they already did just because it feels really good to check it off. And then millennials tend to lead from the middle. So millennials are very collaborative, where it's like, what do you think about this? Well, let's go talk to this person. Let's ask them. And we see collaboration as a strength, whereas maybe older generations saw leaders are the ones who need to know the answers. Millennials are the ones who see leaders are the ones who ask the questions. So there's a shift. And if you don't understand that millennials see leadership as collaborative, it's very easy to look at someone who is a millennial, who's a manager, and you see them working with their team on the solutions, or asking lots of questions, or admitting that they don't know, heaven forbid. I think it's what we've seen is a lot of older managers and leaders see that as a weakness, but millennials see that as a strength. And then Generation Z, which is coming up, is going to lead from the side as well. Very, very similar to Generation X. And so what we teach a lot of is learning generational leadership best practices. How do you lead people who are different than you? And how do you learn to respect that leadership style? And how do you communicate your leadership style? So we've got a lot of young people who are managers now, who are managing people who are much older than them. They don't know how to communicate, this is how I lead, to someone of an older generation who maybe sees their leadership style as weaker and inexperienced. So having conversations around again, that generational empathy, seeing things from other people's perspectives is, I think, more important now than ever, as we are in an ever-changing economy where people are, unfortunately, many of them are being displaced with their jobs. They're trying to figure out what's next for them, and many people even internally inside of their companies are trying to figure out, how do they manage, being a parent or being at home with their kids, and there's a lot going on. So I think empathy overall would go a really long way for all of us as we get through this season.
Gotcha. That's some great stuff. And you've been just like hammering out all this information and all this great stuff. And as we have over drinks or over webinars or whatever, talked for hours at a time, I could keep talking to you, but we are running up against time here. So I want to kind of wrap us up here. But if folks want more information, if they want to know more about you, any of your companies, where you're going to be speaking, when, all that type of stuff, how do they get that information? How do they get a hold of you?
Sure. So we have a brand new book coming out called The Purpose Factor, which we are very, very excited about. We've got people like Tim Tebow and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Tony Dungy and stuff who've come and back and supported and endorsed the book. So it's all about getting clarity about who you are and what to do. So folks can pre-order the book at purposefactorbook.com. Pretty easy to figure out, purposefactorbook.com. And they can get, actually, we've got our last book that came out called Keep Them Longer, which is all about how to, it's all about how to find, keep, and grow great people. And so if you're a manager, if you're a leader, if you're working and dealing with people, it's a super practical guide. It's also a very funny way to be able to incorporate with people. So that's, we're actually doing a free book plus shipping. So you get, the book's totally free, just to help us cover shipping. And you can get that at keepthemlonger.com. keepthemlonger.com to go ahead and get your free book. And I think that's probably some of the best ways to get a hold of me. LinkedIn, where we're really, really active. We're putting together a whole video series of how do you find your purpose during this pandemic. That's going to come out next week. So we're very excited about that on LinkedIn. So follow me for that. And I think that's where you can hang out with me.
Yeah, that's great. We've got a very helpful, somebody saying it's very helpful. Tara has said it's very helpful, signed her a baby boomer. So you've helped in that with her, which is great. And we're glad that we can help you guys out. And speaking of helping you out, we have these webinars, like I've said, every single week. Multiple times a week. We bring you all sorts of different subjects and topics. Our next one will be next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, European Credit Risk Insights and COVID-19. Basically, we're going to be taking a look at two countries or two areas of Europe and how they have like a dichotomy of how they've dealt with the COVID pandemic. We're going to be looking at Scandinavia and the Scandinavian countries and Italy. And we're going to be joined by our country managers for each of those areas on next Tuesday. The CEO of Credit Safe Europe, of Credit Safe Americas and Asia, Matthew Debbage, is going to be moderating that. I'll be hosting it and then handing it over to him for questions and everything. So it's definitely something you don't want to miss. You can find that and the rest of our webinars on creditsafe.com. Go up to the right-hand side where it says B2B guide, and in there is webinars, and you can find all of that. You'll also be able to find this recorded webinar there, and you'll be getting a link to not only Gabrielle's LinkedIn and some of her information, but also to this recorded webinar on an email that you'll be getting in the next couple of days. So Gabrielle, it is great as always to talk to you. It is great to have you. Thank you so much for being with us. This has been great, and I've really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Everyone have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Bye.